Welcome to this sixth lecture in literary criticism. I will be talking to you today about criticism during the period of the Renaissance. We will be talking basically about three of the most important schools of criticism that developed during the Renaissance in Italy, in Holland, and in France. We should mention first that literary criticism did not exist as a discipline itself, so these scholars and writers and authors were not writing literary criticism. They were just writing commentary on literature, on poetry, how to write good poetry, how to develop their language, how to have culture, and so on and so forth. But when we look at it, we see that their comments and analyses of poetry do constitute what we call today literary criticism. So I would like to give you an overview of the most important ideas that developed and circulated during the Renaissance in the movement that is generally called European humanism. Renaissance humanists basically, it was a movement that emerged in Italy first and spread across Europe. And one of the most important things about it is that for the first time in the history of Europe, Europeans were free to ask questions from a human perspective rather than from the supernatural perspectives that the church was imposing on them. Before the Renaissance, you don't find European literature that can ask questions and find answers to important questions from a human perspective. Generally, the church imposed the supernatural perspectives and provided the answers, which also most of the time were supernatural. So this is why humanism chose this name. It's actually a movement that called itself by itself. So they called themselves humanists because they wanted to investigate important questions from a human perspective for human interest. As far as literature is concerned, one important point needs to be made. Renaissance humanism discovered that language was a historical phenomenon. That means that what they realized is that the Latin they were speaking, of course everybody, educated people in Europe spoke Latin at this time, they realized that the Latin they were speaking and the Latin they inherited from the Middle Ages was different from classical Latin, the Latin that was spoken by Cicero, by Horace, by Quintilian and other classical Latin authors and writers. And in this realization, when they realized that their Latin, the Latin they were speaking, was different from the Latin of classical Rome, they essentially established language as a historical phenomenon. I know this is a big word. What does it mean to establish language as a historical phenomenon? Well, if we compare the perspectives on language between two authors, if we choose, for example, Dante and Valla. Dante wrote more around the 13th, 14th century. Valla wrote in the 15th century. For Dante, language was a divinely instituted phenomena. Language was given to humans by God, and the words connected to things by a divine order. It was God that connected the word chair, for example, to the actual chair. And these connections were ordained by God, and no one can change them. So, for example, Dante says that, we assert that a certain form of speech was created by God, together with the first soul. The first soul is Adam and Eve. And I say a form, he says, and I say a form, both in respect of the names of things and the grammatical construction of these names and of the utterances of this grammatical construction. So not only were the names and the words and their connection to things ordained by God, but even the grammar was ordained by God. So in that sense, the Latin that Cicero spoke cannot change because it's ordained by God. If God ordains the grammatical structure of a language, that means that that grammatical structure is going to stay the same. It's not going to change, right? But the Renaissance discovered that language changes, that the Latin they were speaking was far different from the Latin that Cicero or Horace were speaking back in classical Rome. By the 1440s, Italian humanists established the fact that meaning in language is created by humans and shaped by history, and it wasn't given by God as nature. So this is what it means that they established that language is a historical phenomenon. Language is created by man, and it evolves through the contribution and the institutions of man. So Lorenzo Valla, for example, in the 1440s says, "Indeed, even if utterances are produced naturally, their meanings come from the institutions of men. Still, even these utterances, men contrive by will as they impose names on perceived things." It's men who impose names on perceived things. Unless, perhaps, he says, we prefer to give credit for this to God, who divided the languages of man at the Tower of Babel. However, Adam too adapted words to things, and afterwards, everywhere, men devised other words, wherefore, noun, verb, and other parts of speech per se are so many sounds that have multiple meanings through the institutions of men. So this is why he says, Valla says that this is why you find that sounds and words can have multiple meanings. If it was ordained by God, God will devise a meaning and it will stay the same forever. But since it is produced by man, then the meaning of words can evolve and change and mean different things in different times. So this is what it means that the Renaissance humanists established that language is a historical phenomenon. And of course, if we say that language is a historical phenomenon, it means that we can study it, that we can analyze it, that we can chart its developments, its changes, and so on. But if we say that it's ordained by God, that means we cannot analyze it, we cannot study it, we cannot question it, we cannot do any of that. We cannot have a critique of that language. So this is why the Renaissance essentially started criticism, in a way, in European history. This is the first time that Europeans realized that language is created by man and can be analyzed, can be studied, and can be critiqued. This realization, the realization that language is a historical phenomenon, started a period of what is called Neo-Latin imitation. They realized that their Latin was inferior to the Latin that was spoken in Rome. Not only it was different, but it was inferior. It wasn't poetic, it wasn't prosaic, they couldn't write great poems and great plays like the Romans did. So this realization created a period of intense Neo-Latin imitation. They essentially argued that if we want to revive classical Latin, and if we want to make our time, our period, equal in glory and in culture to the period of classical Rome, we need to imitate classical Latin. We need to improve our Latin and make it poetic and capable of producing great, glorious culture, and that would reflect a glorious nation that we are. So they advocated the imitation of Latin masterpieces, and to that end, Cicero they advocated the imitation of Cicero in prose and of Virgil in poetry. This textual practice of imitation reached its peak as will be shown later, in the controversy over whether Cicero should be the exclusive, the only model of imitation, or whether writers and authors should choose multiple authors to imitate. We will come back to that in a minute and talk about whether Cicero should be the only model or whether people should choose multiple models to imitate. The second, so besides discovering the language as a historical fact, the Renaissance also established another very important fact. It's the rise of the vernaculars. The new conception of language led in the 16th and early 17th century to essentially undermining Latin as the privileged language of learning, right? So if you want to study, if you want to become educated, Latin was the only language. Well, now there is competition, and this competition is coming from the European vernaculars. These were languages that weren't prestigious. They didn't have rules, they didn't have grammar, they were just spoken languages. There were no books written on them. These vernaculars, when they will develop, they will become what we know today as French and Italian and English and Spanish and so on. The central tactic for undermining Latin and displacing Latin as the language of learning and replacing it by the vernaculars, there was one central tactic, and it was the production of grammar books. Humanists started writing and publishing grammar books for their European vernaculars. And these grammar books demonstrated that the vernaculars, these vernacular languages, could also be reduced to the same rules and the same grammar as Latin. And when they did that, naturally there is a sense of pride is noticeable among the Europeans, a sense of pride in their languages. They start becoming proud of their native languages. Before they were proud of Latin, but now they're starting to realize that Latin is a foreign language. I have my own language. We have our own language that we can improve and to a point where it becomes as classical and as poetic as Latin. So you find people like Poliziano, for example, saying, let no one scorn meaning insult, this Tuscan language. And Tuscan is a reference to Tuscany. This is the language that was spoken in Tuscany in Italy, which eventually will become the Italian language. So he says, Poliziano says, let no one insult this Tuscan language as plain and meager. He says, if its riches and ornaments, its beauties and its riches are justly appraised, this language will be judged not poor, not rough, but copious and highly polished. We see this sense of pride in the native languages, in the vernaculars of Europe, and we see an attempt to compare these vernacular languages to Latin, and an attempt to get these languages to achieve a state of culture and civility parallel, similar to the prestige that Latin used to have before. The monopoly, the consequences of this process, the rise of the vernaculars, has serious consequences. First of all, the monopoly of classical reality. Before that, classical reality had the monopoly. It was the only subject of written knowledge. Written knowledge, all written knowledge, not only it had to be written in Latin, but it has to be explained through classical reality, through classical images, through the images and the experiences of classical Romans, right? Which means that European experience was not considered a worthy expression, a worthy form of communication to express reality through it. if you want to express your reality, you have to find classical images and classical experiences to express it, to express your reality through it. So this monopoly of classical reality over as the sole language of written knowledge was challenged, and it was rejected. Latin, people rejected Latin being the only language of knowledge. For example, you find people like Jacques Pelletier in France saying things like, he says, "What sort of a nation are we to speak perpetually with the mouth of another?" Speaking with the mouth of another, of course, is a reference to using Latin. He sees Latin, classical Latin, or modern Latin, he sees it as a form of colonization. He sees that's a situation of speaking. They're speaking through the mouth, through the language of another. And he sees it as humiliating. What kind of a nation are we to speak perpetually with the mouth of another? That means we need to speak with our own mouth. Joachim du Bellay in France says the same thing. He says that the Romans labeling the French as barbarians wasn't just. I mean, it's famous that for the Romans, the Europeans were barbarians because they didn't have written languages, they didn't have culture. So for the Romans, the classical Romans, the French and the Dutch and the German and the English and the Spaniards, they were all barbarians. So now Joachim du Bellay in the 16th century, he says the Romans had no right to call or to label the French as barbarians. They had neither right nor privilege, he says, to legitimate thus their nation and to bastardize others. In this defense of the vernacular that we see in the Renaissance, there is it's almost a form of cultural decolonization. Decolonization means istiqlal. It's a form of rejecting cultural colonization, the cultural colonization of Latin and Latin language and culture on Europeans. So the Europeans are rejecting this colonization of Latin, and they want to assert, they want to say that their own languages, their own experiences are worthy of becoming a subject of knowledge and a decent and respectable medium of communication. Richard Wasworth, for example, who is a scholar of the Renaissance, describes this situation best when he says, to have learned to speak with one's own mouth, like Jacques Pelletier demands, to have learned to speak with one's own mouth means to value that speech as both an object of knowledge and the embodiment of a culture worth having. They're saying that my culture is worth having. It is to declare that the materials and processes of daily life are as fully cultural as the ruined monuments and dead languages of the ancient world. It is to overthrow the internalized domination of a foreign community. It is to decolonize the mind. The campaign to defend and promote the vernacular dislodged Latin's monopoly on all forms of written and printed inquiry by the early and mid-17th century. So Latin didn't have the monopoly on written and printed inquiry anymore. Now there is French, there is English, there is German and Spanish and so on. But they also developed, the new European languages started developing, but they developed in imitation of Latin essentially by appropriating the vocabulary, the grammar rules, and the stylistic features of Latin into the vernaculars. What happens basically is that the Europeans started saying, well, if we want our language to become cultured and sophisticated, we don't have enough vocabulary, we don't have enough imagery, we don't have enough poems and that give us new words and so on. We don't have enough technology. So what we do, we extract words and phrases and images from Latin, and we translate them into our language. So if first the establishment of language as a historical phenomena started a period of Neo-Latin imitation. They wanted to imitate their Latin, to imitate classical Latin. In the second period, they want their vernacular languages to imitate classical Latin. The Italian humanist Landino in 1488 says, everyone understands how the Latin language became abundant by deriving many words from the Greek. Basically, that the classical Romans improved their language by imitating the Greek language. He says the Italian language would also become richer if every day we transfer into it more new words taken from the Romans and make them commonplace among our own. So we should do the same thing that the Romans did. We should take words from Latin and make them commonplace among our own. And if you remember from the previous lecture when we talked about how Roman Latin authors preached and advocated the imitation of the Greeks, European writers will do the same thing. They will insist that new writers should imitate Latin writers. They should imitate Cicero, Horace, Quintilian, and Seneca. And they also, like the Romans, they also insist that imitation should lead to originality. That means you shouldn't just imitate word for word, or, you should try to imitate and produce some kind of originality. What becomes apparent is that the European imitation debate was almost a replica, a duplicate of the Roman Latin imitation debate. And I'm just going to give you some brief examples that show how the European imitation debate was almost a copy of the Roman Latin imitation debate. Let's start with Petrarch. Petrarch was the champion of Latin imitation. He advised his contemporaries to listen to Seneca's advice and, quote, imitate the bees which through an astonishing process produce wax and honey from the flowers they leave behind. Remember that the image of the bees producing honey was used by Seneca in classical Rome. Notice how often European authors will now use Seneca's image of the bees to talk about how to write good poetry or how to write good literature. Petrarch says that there is nothing shameful about imitation, about imitating ancient writers and borrowing from them. On the contrary, he said, it is a sign of greater elegance and skill for us in imitation of the bees to produce in our own words thoughts produced from others. Like Seneca and Latin authors, Petrarch insisted that imitation should not reproduce its model. He said, to repeat, let us write neither in the style of one or another writer, but in a style that's uniquely ours, although gathered from a variety of sources. How to produce originality when you imitate the style of others is a difficult question. Petrarch doesn't give a solution to it. And most Renaissance writers don't give a philosophical, dialectical solution to this question. They just give advice. The same thing happens with Pietro Bambo, another important Italian humanist. Pietro Bambo wrote in 1512. He said that first we should imitate the one who is best of all, right? We should imitate the best author among the Latin classics, of course. And he added that we should imitate in a way that we strive to overtake him. Once the model is overtaken, all our efforts should be devoted to surpassing him. Notice that he uses metaphors, images. We should overtake, we should surpass. These are metaphors, images. But he doesn't provide any clear practical steps how to do that. Landino, another Italian humanist, he stressed that the imitative product should not, quote, should not be the same as the ones we imitate, but should be similar to them in such a way that the similarity is scarcely recognized except by the learned, except by those who know the original and the copy and can spot the differences between them. Another Italian humanist, Hieronimo Muzio, who wrote a book called Arte Poetica. Notice the similarity with Horace's book, Horace from classical Rome. Horace's most famous poem, long poem, is called Ars Poetica. So there is the Italian and French and Dutch humanists will write a lot of books with the same title, Art Poetica or Arte Poetica. So Hieronimo Muzio wrote a book called Arte Poetica in 1551. And he started it with the order, he says, direct your eyes with mind intent upon the famous examples of the ancient times, meaning from the Latin classics. From them, he says, one learns to say anything. You can learn to say anything when you imitate the Roman classics. He advised writers to read and even memorize entire books from the Romans of good authors, and he noted that a slight variation of expression and meaning is necessary to make one a poet. So memorize their books, imitate them, but a slight variation is necessary. But then they want to produce originality. How can you produce something original if you imitate classical authors, you memorize their books, you imitate them, and all you do is just do some slight variation? That's not really originality, that's almost plagiarism. Muzio wanted the models to be assimilated by the imitator. The models should be assimilated by the imitator so that writing shall exhale their previously absorbed odors, smells. Like a garment, he says, this is the metaphor, like a garment preserved among roses. When you preserve a garment, a piece of cloth, among roses, and you take it, it smells roses. So the same thing for your poem or your whatever you're writing. If you spend so much time among classical authors and their books, your writing will exhale, it will smell like classical authors, basically. And again, notice that, the use of metaphors. There is no practical steps how to produce this originality. There is metaphors. Giraldi Cinthio, also another Italian humanist, wrote in 1554, he said that after patient study of good authors, meaning classical Latin authors, the writer would find that imitation change into nature. So just study classical authors so long and then imitate them, and that imitation will become nature. That this work, that your work, you the writer, would resemble the model not as a copy but as a father is to son, right? Again, metaphors. The writer, added Cinthio, would not be happy by merely equaling the model. He should try to surpass him, right? Again, a metaphor. Don't just equal the model, try to surpass him, as Virgil, he say, did in his imitation with Homer. Antonio Minturno, from Italy also, another Italian humanist, also uses Seneca's metaphor. He says in his book, also called Arte Poetica, it was written in 1563, he says that the writer should make his borrowed flowers appear to have grown in his own garden, not to have been transplanted from elsewhere, right? Your book is like a garden, and you should make the flowers in it look that they've grown in your garden. You shouldn't make it look like they were transported from somewhere else. Again, notice the use of metaphors and the image of transformation, all of them going back to Seneca. Excuse me. The writer, he says, must transform his material as the bees convert the juice of the flowers into honey. This is straight a metaphor from Seneca, the famous metaphor of the bee. Let's look a little bit at French humanism. Generally, if the Italian discussion is basically a copy of the Roman discussion, the French discussion is a copy of the Italian discussion. Joachim du Bellay echoes Vida, the famous Italian humanist who advised his contemporaries to basically plagiarize. He said, plagiarize the Latins, just steal their words, steal their expressions, steal their poems. Joachim du Bellay in France says the same thing. He advised, he advocated and encouraged French writers to steal, to plunder from the classics. He said, despoil Rome and pillage Greece. Despoil Rome and pillage Greece without conscience. He uses Quintilian's passage without acknowledgement, and he says, there is no doubt that the greatest part of invention lies in imitation. Very reminiscent, it reminds you of Quintilian. And just as it was most praiseworthy for the ancients to invent well, so it is most useful for us, the moderns, to imitate well. They invent, we imitate, even for those whose tongue is still not well, copious and rich. So even if our languages aren't sophisticated yet, we can still imitate their inventions. Du Bellay wrote a book that became very influential. It's called Défense et illustration de la langue française. It was written in 1549. Basically, the title says Defense and Illustration of the French Language. Well, this book is almost a copy, it's almost a replica of Pietro Bambo, the Italian humanist, of his book Prose della Vulgar Lingua. Like Bambo, Du Bellay wanted to invent a language and a poetic tradition in his vernacular, French, that would compete with Latin as a language of culture and civilization. Like Petrarch, Du Bellay also advised the French not to be ashamed to write in their own language in imitation of the Roman classics. The Romans themselves, he said, enriched their language by imitation of the Greeks. By imitating Greek masterpieces, the Romans themselves enriched their own language. And he said we should do the same thing. We should enrich our vernacular languages by imitating the Romans. And using also, Du Bellay also uses Seneca's transformation metaphor, you know, the bees and the food metaphors, without acknowledgement also. He says he describes the process through which the Romans enriched their language as consisting of imitating the best Greek authors, transforming into them, devouring them, notice the metaphor of food, devouring them, and after well digesting them, converting them into blood and nourishment. Notice the use of the metaphor of food. Since there is no shame in imitation, and since the Romans themselves enriched their language through imitation, Du Bellay called on his French compatriots to practice imitation. It is no vicious thing, he says, but praiseworthy to borrow from a foreign tongue, Latin, from a foreign language, sentences and words to appropriate them to our own. Du Bellay, he said, Du Bellay wished that his language was so rich in domestic models that it would not be necessary to have recourse to foreign models, but that wasn't the case. He believed that French poetry is capable of a higher and better form, which must be sought in the Greek and Roman poets. Like Roman and Italian authors, Du Bellay also stressed that imitation should produce some sort of originality. But again, all he gives are just metaphors, like the Italian humanists, like the Roman theorists we saw also. He says, only the rarest and most exquisite virtues are to be imitated. And he impressed on aspirant imitators to, quote, penetrate the most hidden and interior parts of the model author. The third example is from Holland, Dutch humanism. And it's important because it brings in the influence of religion. Naturally, Europeans could not just freely imitate the Romans, right? Because after all, the Romans were pagans, and Renaissance Europe was still fervently Christian. It was still strongly Christian. European authors frequently stressed that the imitation should not undermine the Christian character of their world. This religious issue became important in a debate on whether Cicero should be the only model of imitation, or whether writers should model their writing on multiple writers. And some people argued that Cicero should be the only model. Others argued that no, we should imitate a multitude of writers, and we should take the best thing from various different writers. This question was solved in 1528 by Erasmus, the famous Renaissance humanist. He was Dutch, and he studied in Oxford. He wanted to go to Italy because everybody used to go to Italy to study those days. But he was poor, he didn't have enough money, so he went to Oxford in England instead. The controversy over Cicero, whether Cicero should be the only model, it's basically a controversy over single model, Cicero, or multiple models. And the controversy, the argument, was raging in Italy among Italian humanists. And Erasmus' intervention established once and for all Christian interests and sensibilities as the ultimate limit, the ultimate arbiter for this business, this practice of imitation. What's interesting about Erasmus's intervention is that he uses a technique that was not religion. He argued that religion should be the limit, but he made the argument without using religion. He made the argument using a rational method. He used the concept of decorum. And if you remember, this is the concept that Horace in Ars Poetica made famous. Decorum is basically the question of the manners, the cultural decorum, that things that people should respect, cultural sensibilities and cultural norms and stuff. He basically made two propositions in this very short book, that he called it Ciceronianus. And he made two propositions. The first one, he said, the one who speaks most like Cicero speaks best. You know, if you can speak Latin like Cicero, then you are the best speaker. And he said, the one should, and the good speaking depends on decorum. So if you speak like Cicero, then you're the best speaker. And if you want to be the best speaker, you have to respect decorum. And from this premise, these 2 points, he establishes the premise that since decorum, social norms, social limits, social regulations, since those are very important for good writing and good speaking and good poetry, then one should not speak like Cicero spoke or wrote when he was alive during the Roman Empire, but he should speak as we speak today, meaning during the Renaissance, and as we write today, which means that we should write and speak about Christian subjects in a Christian manner. And therefore, the best speech and the best writing should be done in a Christian manner about Christian topics. And he basically hinted, without coming out and saying it, he accused the Ciceronians, those who were arguing that Cicero should be the only model of imitation, he accused them of being pagans, you know, of being a pagan sect. He says, I hear that a new sect, as it were, of Ciceronians has risen among the Italians. Notice he calls them a sect, a ta'ifa. I think that if Cicero were now living and speaking about our religion, if Cicero was alive today, he would not say, may Almighty God do this, but he would say, may best and greatest Jupiter do this, because Cicero is a pagan. If he was alive today, he would be a pagan, and he wouldn't say, may God do this. He would say, may best and greatest Jupiter and Zeus or any of the pagan gods do this. Nor would he say, may the grace of Jesus Christ assist you, but he would say, may the son of best and greatest Jupiter make that you do succeed. Nor would he say, Cicero, nor would he say, Peter helped the Roman church, but Romulus make the Roman Senate and people prosper. Since the principal virtue of the speaker is to speak with decorum, that's the principal virtue of the speaker and the writer, is to speak with decorum. What praise do they deserve, those who, when they speak about the mysteries of our religion, use words as if they were writing in the times of Virgil and Ovid? Basically, he's saying you should, if you want to be a good writer and a good speaker, you should respect the Christian limits of our culture. But notice what's interesting, he doesn't make the argument using religious arguments, he makes a rational argument. And how does he make this rational argument? Well, he uses the concept of decorum, social norms, so what's socially acceptable. And obviously, Erasmus saw some danger in the practice of imitation, the imitation of the classical Romans. With the rediscovery of pagan written documents and texts, and with their unprecedented diffusion through printing, now they are spread across Europe because of printing, the strong admiration developing among Europeans for classical virtues could not but ring alarm bells for those who, like Erasmus, saw themselves as guardians of Christian virtue. While Erasmus's primary concern in writing the Ciceronianus was to expose Renaissance paganism disguising itself as Ciceronian classicism, he did not rely on religious appeal. Erasmus, according to Pigman, historicized decorum and developed a historical argument and a historical reasoning. So this, more or less, are the three most important humanist traditions of Europe, and this is, in summary, in a short summary, how they related to the question of writing, speaking, composing poems and plays, and producing culture. To conclude, I'll just make 2 or 3 points to conclude. First of all, we notice that the French ideas on imitation, as well as the French imitative practice, meaning even the poems that French writers were writing. So the French imitation debate simply repeats the Italian debate, and the Italian debate simply repeats the Roman debate on imitation. Notice also that Aristotle's poetics, Aristotle's discussion of poetry and literature, and Plato's discussion of poetry and literature seem to be absent from the French, Italian, and Dutch debate. And Aristotle's poetics was rediscovered at this time. It was republished and printed and distributed, but most of the time it became just a book that they used to explain and illustrate Horace's Ars Poetica. And why is there, we might ask, why is it that the humanists did not engage the philosophical question of literature like the Greek did? Why did they just follow the Romans? Well, the answer is very simple. Humanists, European humanists, were not philosophers. They were a class of professional teachers, chancellors, and secretaries. They were connected to European courts through a system of patronage. And basically, they weren't like writing philosophical books or engaging in philosophical discussions about literature and poetry. They just composed documents. They wrote letters to the kings and princes they worked for. They wrote orations and speeches, and they included people who were princes, politicians, businessmen, artists, jurists, theologians, and physicians. Also, another important point is that European humanists recuperated the European Latin theories of style and imitation and so on, and Roman pedagogies of composition and style. The European humanists recuperated these theories, but European humanists were clearly not familiar with Greek discussions and analyses of poetry, especially the analyses of Plato and Aristotle. And this brings us to the end of this session, the end of this lecture. I hope it was beneficial and useful, and أستودعكم الله ولقائي معكم في الحلقة المقبلة إن شاء الله والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله.